This is the RPG Crawler. In the first video in this series, we took a look at the origins of the hobby, where the work of Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax began to come together with role-playing scenarios based on wargames. This culminated in the creation of Tactical Studios Rules in 1973, for the creation of various wargaming products and rule sets. However, the very next year, TSR published a different category of gaming altogether: Dungeons and Dragons, which would begin the RPG industry's rise. Credited to Gygax and Arneson, the original Dungeons and Dragons was produced with a boxed set, in an initial run of 1,000 copies that first year in various formats, with a second and third run throughout 75, each with a few additional thousand, during which time variations in printing and distribution were made constantly. These all used wood-grain printed boxes, but the fourth print run, where production jumped up to 25,000 and was distributed more widely, used a white box design. This is why this edition of Dungeons & Dragons is often called the White Box Edition, as well as OD&D, and why various retro-clone rules that seek to mimic this early stage of the RPG use the term white box in their name. Additional print runs occurred from 1975 all the way through 1979, and this version was stocked in many places even after its successor games hit the shelves. Later versions were changed to exclude references to Tolkien lore. For instance, hobbits became halflings, while a few monster names were changed as well. During this time, TSR went through some rapid changes, growing from a simple partnership to a proper company with full-time employees, and suffered its first loss in the sudden death of Don Kay, which eventually set the stage for the tumultuous history that plagued TSR through the 1980s and 90s. However, this was also the time when a lot of innovations were made in the industry, and would set the stage for future, more polished role-playing products. So with this time frame in mind, let's take a look at the general contents of the original Dungeons & Dragons boxed set. While print runs varied in the details, for the most part the boxed set included 3 rulebooks: Men in Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. It also included a reference sheets booklet which contained necessary tables taken from the various rules, so you didn't have to search through all 3 booklets. Later versions also included a corrections sheet with errata. Of note is that these boxes did not come with dice. Rather, sets of polyhedral dice were sold separately. Now let's take a look at the contents of each booklet. I'll note that I've never actually owned a physical copy of these books, so this will be based on the PDFs, a version of which are, as of this recording, available for purchase online. I will of course put a link in the description below. As I'm going over these books, I will cover the contents in brief, but especially take a look at where they differ from later editions. Book 1, Men in Magic, covers character creation and advancement, combat, and so forth. This was from a time before the idea that some information might be reserved only to the Dungeon Master or the referee, although other books do have entries that you would expect the Dungeon Master to have command of. Indeed, at this point, the term referee was still being used widely instead. Still, one could do quite a bit of adventuring with just the information in this very first booklet. It opens with a foreword, then an introduction, which I imagine would have been far more useful in that era, when the very concept of RPGs was new and a developing thing. Interestingly enough, aside from just a basic introduction to role-playing, it mentions that the game could be expanded to scenarios other than strictly medieval fantasy, such as ancient prehistory or futuristic, and there is mention that up to 50 players could be handled by a single referee. 50 players! Imagine that! Another thing of interest to more modern readers is that the recommended equipment list includes some strange things. It includes not only the Dungeons & Dragons set, dice, etc., but also the Chainmail Miniatures rules from TSR, and Outdoor Survival, which is from Avalon Hill, a completely different company altogether. These were expected to be used for rules for combat and outdoor travel. There's a section on preparation, which basically consists of preparing and populating the dungeon maps, then an immediate look at character classes. Originally, Dungeons & Dragons only had 3 classes: Fighting Men, which came to be called Fighters later, Magic Users, the wizards of the game, and Clerics, the fighting priests. Each of these has only a few paragraphs detailing them, talking about the expected role and powers that the said class gains, as well as what followers they may one day obtain. This is followed by a list of races, including dwarves, elves, halflings, and a quick snippet of others. In this edition, the races were still separate from the classes, but were sorely limited in which of the 3 classes they could take, so they may as well have been classes unto themselves. At least until the add-on books hit later on. Dwarves and halflings were simply fighting men, while elves could switch freely between fighting men and magic users at the beginning of each adventure. The classic 3 character alignments of law, neutrality, and chaos had their origins here as well, although rather than some long-winded discussion over what an alignment is, its presence is simply mentioned and then a chart of example creatures provided. There's brief rules on changing classes which humans can do, and they bear a strong resemblance to dual classing in later editions of the game. Rules for ability score generation are given, and the basic, harsh 3d6 in order over the classic of 6 ability scores appears here for the very first time. The explanation of abilities follows and is brief, but interestingly enough gives rules for using non-prime requisite ability scores as prime requisites, at a reduced rate of course, for experience bonuses. Rather than having ability score bonuses and effects each in their own table, an ability score bonus is listed all together with all of the others. Notably different from later games, the maximum bonus or penalty for most scores is just plus or minus 1, so you don't see a huge range of bonuses that you might get in a modern game. There's a section on languages which very much resembles the most versions of the game, although here alignment languages are mentioned for the first time. A section on NPCs follows, but it mostly spends time on hirelings and charmed monsters, as I suppose both are of more immediate concern in combat. A basic reaction table is there to determine NPC reactions to the characters on the fly. In fact, this section goes into detail on capturing non-monster characters for service and determining the loyalty of NPCs, and is actually almost better fleshed out than something you'd find in a more modern system as far as that's concerned. Mention is also made of family members or heirs to determine who might get your character's belongings when they meet their messy demise, and potentially become a new PC, of course. A typical equipment list follows, with costs but no further information, followed by encumbrance rules which, I guess, include weights, although only for a few select items. The information is kind of scattershot from there. Then there's the experience tables that go up to level 9 for fighting men, 11 for magic users, and 8 for clerics, except that actual levels aren't actually given, so much as titles. Hit dice and spells per day are listed in the classic Vancian manner in a separate table, and a curious thing about this particular version occurs, in that rather than their different sorts of polyhedral die, each class uses simply different numbers of individual d6s per level depending on class. Some rules are given to progress past the limits on the table, where finally levels are referred to by number. And then there's the alternative combat system, which can be used in lieu of the one from Chainmail. While the tables provided don't necessarily break down to the same granularity that we see in later editions, it does use a familiar d20 to hit against an armor class determined by armor type, modified by the level of the attacker. All attacks, regardless of weapon, deal 1d6 damage on a hit. After the combat system, there's the saving throw system, where we see the first familiar categories of Death Ray/Poison, Wands, Polymorph or Paralyzation, Stone, Dragon Breath, and Staves and Spells. It functions pretty much like you see in the first few editions of the game, with a d20 roll versus the number on the chart indicated by class and level. The first book closes out with a basic guide to magic, starting with a list of magic and cleric spells, with many of them having only a single sentence or paragraph to explain them, except for the very most complex ones. Like later editions, they are divided by level, with a maximum of 6 level spells for magic users and 5th for clerics. There aren't that many spells all in all, but many of the classics are present here, such as Fireball, Magic Jar, Disintegrate, Cure Light Wounds, and Raise Dead. After the spell description, there's a quick explanation of magical research to create additional spells as well as rules for spellbooks. Volume 2, Monsters and Treasure, is a combination monster list and treasure list. It opens with a quick reference list of all the monsters included, with the name, number appearing, movement, hit dice, percent chance you encounter them in their lair, and treasure types to roll for them. Monster descriptions follow thereafter, although it is noted that special abilities once more refer back to chainmail rules, unless otherwise noted. The monster descriptions list a paragraph or two of physical description, plus any variations that might appear or special things to keep in mind. Some of these entries are surprisingly detailed, especially those for humans and humanoids that might organize themselves into a military, in which case descriptions of various units you might encounter are given, along with the percentage chance that each might be present. Of a special note is the dragons, as this is where the classic division between the evil chromatic and the lawful golden dragons begins, as well as rules for subduing said dragons to sell them and make them serve you. The monster rules make up fully half of this volume, while the second half is devoted for treasure. There is a chart of treasure types that shows what percentage chance certain ranges of coins, gems, jewelry, or magic items, or maps might be present. The magic items listed are basic, but should be very familiar to anybody who's played any version of Dungeons & Dragons, or role-playing games in general. It has weapons with bonuses, some of which might have additional bonuses against certain enemies, armor with its own bonuses, potions that provide magical effects, scrolls that have spells on them, rings that provide permanent or activatable magical effects, wands and staves that can call forth spells or unique magical effects, and finally miscellaneous magical items like the Girdle of Giant Strength or the Flying Carpet. Few of these are given more than a paragraph of description, although there is actually an entire section on intelligent swords. This chapter closes out with basic rules to generate gemstones and jewelry, as well as conversion rates between the different sorts of precious metals. Volume 3, The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, tells us how to create adventures and run campaigns. It starts with guidelines on the minimum size for a dungeon, and basic techniques on how to map it out. While those who enjoy mega dungeons will no doubt enjoy the idea that at least 3 levels should be mapped, and a good dungeon will have no less than a dozen levels down, this will probably sound rather extreme to most RPG players. A sample map and key are given, and then an example list of traps. Any dungeon map that is generated has to be populated. So what follows the map creation guidelines are rules and suggestions for populating the dungeon with monsters and treasure, including tables for coin amounts for unguarded treasure. A section on refreshing the map and contents with new monsters/changes follows this, and is entirely acceptable considering how much adventuring was supposed to be taking place in these old school dungeons. Movement and timing rules follow, and thus the turn equals to 10 minutes, round equal to 1 minute standard is set that would be followed throughout the next few editions. Yet another interesting note is mentioned here, because it explicitly states that a certain amount of time should be taken resting each hour, and after battle and flight, which I suppose makes some sense, and really helps to drag out the exploration time. Other rules for exploration are here too, from secret door and trap detection rolls, determining sound, lighting, and vision, etc., etc. Any class can try to detect noise. Remember, this is before thieves were introduced. Rules for encounters with underworld monsters follows, including rules for surprise, wandering monsters, and wandering monster tables, as well as rules to avoid monsters. Amusingly, aside from a number of other notes, this includes rules for dropping treasure and food to distract the monsters of various intelligence types. There's also a random monster action table, basically a reaction roll to see how the monsters act when confronted by the party. The Underworld section concludes with an example of play over a few pages. Next is the Wilderness section, which begins with a suggestion on how to map out the ground level and immediate environs of a starting dungeon in town, then immediately brings in Outdoor Survival, an entirely separate product. It's really amusing because while the rules following it provide ways to randomly generate the contents of castles, including troop layout and the like, the whole point of including Outdoor Survival is simply to use the game board and the movement rules. This is doubly amusing because there are then rules for exploration restated, as well as the idea of using a basic hex map. So honestly, reference to the Outdoor Survival rules at all, like reference to the chainmail rules previously, ends up being just shy of pointless. You can easily run an adventure using just the rules in the booklet without the separate product. The next section goes into encounters with wilderness monsters, and follows the same sort of scheme that the Underworld encounter rules use, except it also adds rules for getting lost. The evasion and pursuit rules are also a little bit different since they take place over larger swaths of terrain. After this, rules for building, staffing, and upkeeping castles and strongholds are given. It's interesting to see this mostly because of how much it is downplayed in the main books of some later editions, although at this point in the game it was still quite close to its wargaming roots. The rules are given more on a good starting guideline for further development than a complete system, however. This is followed by rules for land and aerial combat, or rather, adaptations of the chainmail rules for this purpose, although mention is made of the combat system introduced in Booklet 1, and that one is perfectly usable instead of the chainmail rules in the scenarios given here. There are even rules for naval combat, quite detailed rules in fact. I don't think I've seen this well-developed a combat system for the naval combat arm of the branch mentioned in a D&D core rulebook ever since, and in fact even the supplementary books rarely go into this much detail. The book then closes out with a look at natural healing and time passing during a campaign, as well as a brief afterword, encouraging the referee to develop their own rule set for their table. The entire collection suffers a bit from its pioneering nature. The partial reliance on external products is one thing, but the artwork and layout are also of a quality that might be considered amateur at best even at the time. This was somewhat alleviated in later editions and later printings, but for a modern reader looking back on the original Dungeons & Dragons, it can be a difficult system to run. In fact, unofficial fan edits and retro clones abound on the internet, with the main purpose being presenting these rules in a more user-friendly format. That having been said, the original versions of Dungeons & Dragons are still very playable to this day, and include much of what would become the core experience of D&D. The classic races are there, if not all the classes, and we see the familiar combat tables, saving throws, use of armor class, hit dice and hit points, experience levels. Even the magic system will begin to take the form of what will define D&D for most of its existence. It is recognizably D&D to somebody who's played most other versions, even down to the presence of some monsters and items that may be called product identity nowadays. Admittedly, some people might find the presentations here quaint at best. Now, some things were missing from the white box rule set that would later become stock parts of Dungeons & Dragons. By the end of the original version's lifespan, many of these had been included, either through articles in Strategic Review, the newsletter that preceded Dragon Magazine, or through the 5 expansion books that were released for the game. Now, throughout the rest of this series, I'm not going to go through every expansion in detail, but during these formative years, I think it's worth at least touching on the relevant points of these first few supplements for the game. The first supplement, Greyhawk, included the addition of thieves as their own class, as well as the concept of subclasses in the form of paladins, wider ability score adjustments, including exceptional strength for fighters, differential hit dice so that classes don't just use different numbers of d6s, expanded spell tables and spell lists to accommodate 9th level spells for wizards and 7th for clerics, variations for calculating monster XP on the fly, weapon types versus AC adjustments, different weapon damage rolls, additional monsters including some classics, and a slew of additional magic items, etc. In effect, the Greyhawk supplement alone brought the game's complexity almost to the point where you might begin to see the development of elements that would become classic advanced Dungeons & Dragons elements. Supplement 2, Blackmore, was Dave Arneson's credit, and includes monks and assassins as classes, hit location tables, weapon height adjustment rules, more monsters, more treasure, but also an entire adventure location keyed and described. Rules on diseases finally close out the book. While the contributions from this supplement really didn't have the same lasting impact as the one from Greyhawk, aside from the new classes and some of the monsters and treasure, this supplement did set the stage for the development of the campaign, which created an entire supplement series that appeared in later editions. Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry, showcased the growing talent pool of TSR at the time, and showed marked improvements in design. Content-wise, it included rules for druids, basic psionics, some alternative combat system rules, a collection of demons and otherworldly creatures, descriptions of psionic powers, new spells, and rules and examples of artifact-level magic items. What can I say, but a surprising amount of this was held over into later editions, if not exactly the same format. Supplement 4, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, basically had descriptions and statistics for gods of various pantheons, sort of a stripped-down version of what you'd later see in things like deities and demigods. Now, this was technically the last of the main supplements for Dungeons & Dragons, but one last book did come out, Swords and Spells, and that rewrote the mass combat rules, replacing the chainmail ones, thus bringing the game full circle. So by the end of this supplement cycle, a robust game was in place, one that could stand alone without the third-party products that were suggested in the original box set. Dungeons & Dragons had almost every element that modern gamers might recognize. So effective was this game, in terms of popularizing the genre, that a number of groups play these original rules in one form or another to this day, either using one of the reprints or re-released PDFs, or through a retro clone, many of which arose from the OSR movement of just years past. Its impact was felt far beyond the tabletop, as a number of the earliest computer role-playing games developed during the late 70s to the early 80s would be recognized as simple clones of this system. Of course, there was definitely room for improvement, and in the different supplements produced, one can see two fundamental philosophies in approaching the rules beginning to form and conflict. And this would set the stage for the next development in Dungeons & Dragons, which I will cover in an upcoming video. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with my D&D Retrospective. If you like what you've seen, please leave a like, comment below if you have any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. If you would like to help support this channel, or have a hand in shaking what you'd like to see coming up, please visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/rpgcrawler, or via the links at the end of the video or below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.